Tully, let's talk
Good
about
to see
this.
You, Marina.
I was listening in on this hearing. It was, shocking in some regards to hear him pleading guilty when he pleads guilty to each count of the murder of each victim being named. These are the pictures there. You've got the prosecution on the top left of your screen, the defense there with Brian Kohberger in that tie, and the judge beneath him here. Sentencing as to what the judge will decide will be July 23rd, but it seems as though life in prison it'll be for Brian Kohberger. What do you make of this plea deal?
I think it was a good decision by both sides. The defense didn't really have a good case, a defense at all. The judge had been denying a lot of the defense motions, really critical motions, even going so far as to say that the defense could not present evidence that somebody else did it. So, and then for the prosecution side, while they had a very, very, very strong case, it did depend in some instances on circumstantial evidence, and they got to spare the families the pain of having a lot more of this tragedy aired out in public. So I thought it was good. You know, the defense did their job in avoiding the death penalty, and the prosecution secured 4 consecutive life sentences against a convicted murderer.
Without the possibility of parole, without the possibility of appeal, and even if it seems as though there's some legislation down the line, the judge said that this would also be without the possibility of looking back at the case and reducing that sentence. So Brian Kohberger, for all intents and purposes, will serve life behind bars. And yet, to your point, some of the victims' families not too pleased with this plea deal. They said that they had no idea that they'd been shut out, that they were just informed via a letter from the government. They had to turn around quickly, get to Idaho so that they would be there today, because this was done, the judge said, very quickly in order to preserve that guilty plea deal as to maybe Brian Kohberger could change his mind. I guess that's happened before in court as well. Is this something that, you can't make everybody happy and the government has to take that reign without the consideration of all families?
Correct, yes. Charges are brought by the government. It's not by, families, victims. It's always brought by the government. And while they do owe families consent, and it's just common courtesy to reach out to families and have them involved in the process, ultimately it is the government's decision whether or not to file a case, whether or not to pursue certain charges, and whether or not to enter into a plea agreement. The plea agreement did have to be accepted by the judge, but with the defense and prosecution both wanting it, the judge accepted the plea deal. So I think that, you can't make everybody happy, but I think that justice was served here.
I'm curious, as someone who, look, I've covered many trials here, and you get a case like this where there's so much emotion, there's so many families, victims here. If with the plea deal, the government could have asked for also a confession. He's clearly confessing that he committed these murders, but how? Is that something that is usually asked upon? Because what we saw after he pled guilty was the government, in essence, showing what their case, what their evidence was, what the witnesses would hear, what they would see. Because there was no trial, they still put on the case in effect before the judge. Should the families been afforded a confession of sorts other than the plea from Brian Kohberger?
It's very difficult to do that, not only logistically, but legally speaking as well. Someone has a right to remain silent, but then, when they're convicted, they don't have that right. But logistically, it's very difficult to do. So I've never seen it done in court. Okay. The way that you would do that normally is you would have a sentence on the table. You might get lowest 5 years, highest 10 years. Give your confession at sentencing and see what the judge says. That's the way that you can make that happen. But here, Mr. Kohberger pled to 4 counts of first-degree murder for life in prison consecutive on each. So there was really no way to force him. And if he decided not to say anything, he's already going to be in prison for life. You
Sure.
can't really impose any additional penalty on him.
I do want to ask really quickly before we go, this was the criminal case. Clearly he's guilty now, assuming that guilt himself. But also on the civil side, if he were to share his story one day and look to profit off of it, even though he probably can't have really much, considering he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life, is there something and some remedy recourse that the families can have to go after that, to stop that from happening, or at least get that money from him?
A lot of times that's handled with state courts. Certain states have legislation where a criminal can't profit off their criminality by publishing a book or getting a movie made, something like that. And how the families would do that is they would sue Brian Kohberger and get a judgment against him, so that if he ever did come into any money, it would go to the families to satisfy that judgment.
All right, but I imagine he still would, in some way, somehow, could tell a story if he'd like to. I guess that's a different conversation for a different day. Certainly so many ramifications from that. An incredibly sad day still for those families. Joseph, thank you so much for bringing that down. Let's move on, because 23andMe has a new owner. A bankruptcy judge approving the sale of the company to a nonprofit run by one of its co-founders.